I'm Stefan Haggard at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. This is the Korea Pacific Program webinar series, which has gotten very generous support from the Korea Foundation, so we really appreciate their help. Let me tell you what's coming up. We've got at least 2 more sessions over the next several weeks, and then 1 more that is still being negotiated. First, next Monday, at noon, which is a different hour from our usual meeting time, we're going to have Melissa Hannum at the One Earth Future in Vienna talking to us about using satellite imagery to study North Korea. Melissa was up at the Monterey Institute for a number of years and is really one of the top analysts of this kind of data in the United States, and she follows North Korea very closely. So this is going to be a very interesting session, both because of the substance, but also her discussion of the North Korean case. And so on November 30th, I'm pleased to announce that Sandra Fahey is going to be joining us. She wrote a book based on interviews with survivors of the North Korean famine. And she's come out with a new book called Dying for Rights, which is basically a review of the efforts of the international community to discuss human rights in North Korea. So that should be an interesting session as well from an anthropologist who brings a somewhat different methodological perspective to these issues. And today, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. We're going to go in a somewhat different order, starting with Ed Goldring. I met Ed when he was a PhD student up at USC, working with Dave Kong. He's now a postdoctoral fellow in the Division of Social Sciences at Hong Kong University. We particularly appreciate that he's checking in from Hong Kong. And he has a great dissertation and I think some papers with a title that's something like Keep Your Enemies Close. And he's going to be talking about some of that work. Second, Trinh should be joining us shortly. He's a PhD student here at GPS, and he's been doing work on Vietnam. And so hopefully he'll be logging in shortly. I think he might have had some problems getting on. And then finally, Victor Shih will comment on this. But just to step back, the theme of today's panel is on purges. That is how authoritarian regimes use purges as a way of both managing potential opposition among elites, but also securing loyalty among factions within the party state. So Ed, do you want to lead us off? I think that if you've got some slides, you should be able to share them. So.
Sure, sounds great. Pull them up. Okay, can you see my slides okay?
Yeah, they look great.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you very much to Professor Haggard for the introduction and the invitation to speak today. Seeing the speakers you have coming up, I feel very honored to be invited because those are some absolutely fantastic speakers coming up. The research that I'm presenting today, it contains part of the theory and some illustrative qualitative evidence from the book manuscript that I'm working on, and that has evolved from what was my PhD dissertation, and it's on the causes and effects of elite purges in dictatorships. So as the title indicates, today I'm going to discuss a single question about authoritarian politics. Why do dictators purge or retain disloyal elites? And then I'll illustrate my answer with qualitative evidence of a single high-profile purge in North Korea, one that I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with already, that of Jangsong Tech. Okay, so starting from a comparative perspective then, it's well known that dictators lose power to coups more than any other method. So the figure on screen shows that since the end of World War II, more dictators have lost power to coups than any other kind of exit, including notably to popular threats, i.e. revolutions, or to foreign overthrow. And the literature on purges very much reflects this. So the key strand that ties together the small amount of research on the causes of purges is that whether a dictator believes that they're threatened by a coup is crucial to affecting patterns of elite purges. So in the comparative literature, most notably, Jun Koga-Saduth argues that dictators are likely to purge the military when coup threats are reduced, because this provides them with an increased opportunity to conduct purges, as they're least likely to experience retaliation. And then alternatively, work by Milan Sfolik has described that, or it implies rather, that dictators are more likely to purge elite when the coup threat increases. But regardless of which way the relationship works between coup threats and elite purges, the key theme that sort of unites the existing literature as it relates to purges, it just strongly emphasizes how coup threats affect purges. But of course, dictators must also worry about alternative types of threat to coups for two reasons. And so returning to the figure that I showed you initially, so now I break it down for during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. And you can see that in the post-Cold War period, in these lighter gray shades, you can see that coups have remained the most prominent kind of exit for dictators, but they actually take up a much smaller share of total exits. So popular and foreign threats have become more prominent kinds of exits for dictators. And second, of course, these threats don't exist in a vacuum. They're not independent of each other. They're the complete opposites. They're interdependent. So protests or foreign pressure themselves might not unseat dictators, but they might reveal a dictator's weakness and lead to the military launching a coup. So thus, given coup threats affect how a dictator manages his ruling coalition, because they affect his prospects for survival, it's reasonable to expect that these other threats, popular and foreign threats, or outsider threats, as I'm going to term them, also influence a dictator's management of the ruling coalition. So with that context established, I'm now going to turn just to summarizing my argument briefly about how popular and foreign threats affect a dictator's management of disloyal elites. And so to summarize the argument, I argue that a dictator is more likely to purge a disloyal elite than not, because their presence in the ruling coalition threatens the dictator's position by elevating the coup threat. That's fairly uncontroversial. However, if there's a high outsider threat, i.e. a heightened threat from the people or from foreign states, and the elite possesses certain attributes that can help the dictator alleviate that outsider threat, then this increases the likelihood that the dictator will retain that official even if they're disloyal. And just one point of clarification is that I would agree that there's always a positive probability of a dictator purging a disloyal elite, but it's simply that that positive probability is reduced when the dictator has a greater need for a specific official to help them manage an outsider threat from the people or a foreign state. And so this leads to two hypotheses. First, a dictator is more likely to retain a disloyal elite when there's a high outsider threat and the elite's attributes correspond to the outsider threat. And second, a dictator is more likely to purge a disloyal elite when either of these conditions are absent. And so this argument perhaps builds most closely on the formal literature on the competence-loyalty trade-off, including work by former and current UCSD scholars, Blake McMahon and Branislav Slanchev. But my research differs from work on the competence-loyalty trade-off in several ways. And this includes, so I largely assume that elites are competent. Although scholars have previously shown work including, have previously shown that leaders including, say, Saddam Hussein employed loyal but incompetent officials as he was paranoid about coups. Generally, dictators tend to prefer technically competent officials, as recent work in CPS by Hill and Schuler has shown. And my work also offers an explanation for the fact that dictators sometimes treat disloyal elites differently, despite both might be competent. And so in my book manuscript, I explored this question and others in several country contexts, and this includes Park Chung-hee's South Korea and Kim Jong-un's North Korea. But today, I'm going to focus exclusively on North Korea and the process of how one elite was initially retained and then purged, and that was Jang Song-taek. So I collect data on North Korea's ruling coalition between May 2012 and April 2015. And I identify members of North Korea's ruling coalition based on membership of what at the time were three key institutions. So full membership of the Politburo, also full membership of the National Defense Commission, which of course has subsequently turned into the State Affairs Commission, and full membership of the Central Military Commission. So grey shading signifies membership of at least one of these institutions, and a red line indicates a purge, defined as Kim Jong-un forcibly removing the individual from all memberships of these institutions. So for instance, at the bottom of the screen, or near the bottom, you see Ri Yong-ho was purged quite prominently in July 2012, whereas others who drop out the data set either retired voluntarily due to health or old age, or they died of natural causes. So the process—
And can I just ask one clarifying question? So you don't distinguish between purges with respect to the severity of how the purged person is treated, because obviously you can be killed, you can be retired temporarily and then re-enter politics, or you can be retired permanently and not re-enter, but still keep your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So in the first chapter, I do a conceptualization of what a purge is, because existing political science work, I don't think realizes that it uses a complete range of different definitions to define a purge. And as Professor Haggard identifies, this can include different outcomes, which I would summarize as being demoted to the point where you're no longer in the ruling coalition, maybe banished to like a far-flung region, jailed, or even executed. For the purpose of this work today, no, I'm not distinguishing between different severity in terms of outcome, but in a different chapter, I'm looking at why some types of purges are more violent than others. But for the purposes of today, no, just the definition of a purge is forcibly removed from the ruling coalition by Kim Jong-un. Okay, and so the processes of a dictator retaining or purging a disloyal elite are respectively at the top and bottom of this slide you're looking at now. I'm going to walk through each different stage, so don't worry too much about reading every single square that's on screen now. So I'm going to describe the purge of Jang Song-taek, Kim Jong-un's uncle, as illustrative evidence for my argument. And data for this account of Jang's purge comes from a combination of text-based sources, such as Ken Gause's book, international and domestic media, and then also oral evidence, which I conducted interviews with South Korean and North Korean experts in Seoul, to the extent that anyone can be an expert on elite politics in North Korea. So first, the scope condition of the argument is that the elite behaves disloyal in the eyes of the dictator. Now, of course, disloyalty is often a hidden characteristic, as an elite doesn't want a dictator to know that they're disloyal. And so in the book's theory, I identify several behaviors that if a dictator observes, then he identifies the elite as disloyal. And one of them is disagreeing with the dictator over policy. And Jang certainly exhibited this trait, as in 2011 and 2012, he advocated for Chinese-style economic reforms, despite Kim Jong-un's reticence for them. I also found media reports that Jang considered a coup attempt, which North Korea also later claimed in the text announcing his execution, but I didn't find these data to be credible, and they were summarily dismissed by the experts I spoke to in South Korea. But nonetheless, I think there is evidence that Jang Song-taek was disloyal towards Kim Jong-un in the latter's eyes. And second, when we think of outsider threats to North Korea, we often describe American threat towards the regime. But I found that in Kim Jong-un's earliest years, the biggest foreign threat to his rule was actually from China. And significant Kim family funds were held in various Chinese banks, which placed like a stranglehold on Kim's ability to provide private goods. So China was also reported to be concerned about Kim Jong-un, given they knew relatively little about him when he came to power, and his youth and experience allegedly made them doubt whether he would successfully be able to lead North Korea. And so I think that Kim successfully identified this as a source of threat. He sought independence from potential Chinese economic coercion and tried to obtain the Kim family funds that were held in Chinese banks. And although ultimately he was unable to do this, it demonstrates his appreciation that he was in a weak position, or he was vulnerable rather, to Chinese economic coercion, and it shows his desire to free himself from that straitjacket. And there's little doubt that Kim recognized Chiang's ability to help him manage his relationship with China in the early years of his rule. So Kim dispatched Chiang to China to try and secure the release of the Kim family funds. And indeed, Chiang had a long-standing relationship with key Chinese officials, and in fact was treated akin to a head of state when he visited China. So thus Kim initially retained Chiang in key bodies that gave him membership of the ruling coalition, because he was important to Kim to help him try and manage that relationship with China. But in the first half of 2013, circumstances changed. So North Korea's economy began to grow, which gave Kim greater financial autonomy. And also Chiang had failed to secure the release from the Chinese banks of the Kim family funds. And so these 2 points taken together, I argue, believe that Chiang's potential usefulness to managing North Korea's relationship with China was expiring, and Kim had begun to free himself from Chinese pressure. So Chiang's utility to Kim in helping him manage his relationship with China declined. And so in Kim's first 2 years in power, he likely viewed Chiang as disloyal throughout. But what had changed in the second half of 2013 is that Chiang was no longer relevant to helping Kim manage this important outsider threat. A common alternative explanation, just briefly, is that Chiang was very powerful when Kim came to power, and so Kim had to wait to consolidate his power before he could purge Chiang. But we know that Kim purged other similarly, if not more powerful elites prior to Chiang, including Ri Yong-ho, who I mentioned earlier, who had greater access to military force and so likely represented a greater coup threat. So an explanation of Chiang's purge predicated on balance of power amongst elites and Kim within the regime makes little sense to explain Chiang's purge when considered alongside alternative purges. Finally, I just add that the process of process tracing isn't necessarily to eliminate alternative explanations. I'm not arguing that my explanation is the only explanation for Chiang's purge, but it shows that the events examined are consistent with the proposed theory. And then finally, just to very briefly, because I'm sure I'm out of time, summarize some of the work's contributions. So the work directly contributes to research on authoritarian survival, by showing how dictators use purges to stay in power and manage alternative threats. Intelligence on the politics of ruling coalitions is also vital to informing grand strategy. And finally, in the book manuscript, I actually used the research on North Korea as an external validity probe for other cases. But this builds on work, recent work, say, in comparative politics by Mahdavi and Ishiyama, which suggests that North Korea can be further integrated into the comparative politics literature on authoritarian survival, rather than being considered as a unique case, which it often is. So thank you again to you all for tuning in and listening. I really look forward to any questions or comments. And thank you again to Professor Haggard for the invitation to speak.
And well, that was just absolutely terrific. And Sui, while you're getting your slides up, maybe we can pull Ed's down, and I'll just ask one kind of clarifying question, and it has to do with the value or the liability of being a part of the family in North Korea. I mean, this is a curious regime, obviously, because it's both a party system, which is institutionalized in a particular way, but at the same time personalized. Is there anything about Chiang's status as a family member that made him particularly vulnerable? You didn't make mention of that. And it's obviously an idiosyncratic feature of the case, but I'm wondering if that could be treated almost like an asset, which which he held, which made him more dangerous.
Yeah, I think that Jiang's status as a family member both worked for him and against him at different times. And I think it largely depended on the status of his relationship with his wife, Kim Jong-il's sister, Kim Kyung-hee.
Right.
So I think when that relationship was better in the sort of 80s, 90s, and even to an extent in the early 2000s, I think it really helped him secure his place within Kim Jong-il's inner circle. But by the time Kim Jong-un had already come to power, I think it's Ken Gores who claims that essentially Kim Kyung-hee's blessing for Jiang's purge, and specifically his violent purge, rather than the demotion he suffered previously in 2004, was quite important.
Okay, that's great. Just to remind our listeners, if you have a question, a qualifying question, please put it into the Q&A and I'll ask it. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to Zwi's presentation, about 15-20 minutes, Zwi, and then Victor will offer some comments and then we'll open it back up. Zwi?
All right, thank you, Steph, and thank you everyone for having me here. So today, I think what I'm going to present about is sort of a novel, at least to me, a novel theory on how purges occur in authoritarian regimes. And that includes not just North Korea, at least in my theory, but also other non-democracies in the world. But my evidence, my empirical evidence for these mostly draw from Vietnam and China. I do have a range of quantitative evidence pointing to the pardons of protection and purges in these regimes, as well as historical evidence, which I will be presenting mostly about today. But so what you'll see mostly today will be the historical comparisons between Vietnam and China. But if you would like to ask, I would like to see more about these actual raw numbers, feel free to ask in the Q&A after that, happy to share. Anyway, so I think the rationale for this research starts from similar to what you have seen before, right? We have known about purges. A common image associated with dictatorships across the world is that of elite purge, right? The forced, swift, and often violent removal of a regime's own elites, those who take part in ruling the regime itself, has been observed in regimes both historical and contemporary, from say Nazi Germany to Soviet Russia, or as you see today, North Korea. But why purges seem to be something very high profile, something to be very common in the non-democratic world, actually they don't look the same. And in fact, they don't seem to be very widespread either. Actually, regimes don't purge all the time. And when purges happen, sometimes they occurred in a massive purge with a lot of people being purged, with very violent ends for the victims. Sometimes a couple of people got purged and nothing else happened. Let me just give you a contrasting picture to illustrate that case. On the left is a picture of the trial of Jiang Zemin, senior Chinese Communist Party official and chairman of China National Petroleum Oil Corporation. In 2014, he was investigated, expelled from the party, and then convicted for 16 years on charges of corruption. His fall from grace from a powerful position is what we consider a purge of a tiger during China's anti-corruption campaign. So this is Jiang Zemin. And on the right is another trial, this time taking place in Vietnam, also during a well-celebrated anti-corruption campaign in 2008. But make no mistake, the ones on trials here are not the tigers. They are not exactly flies or lower-ranking officials either. They are journalists arrested and on trial for their involvement in uncovering a multi-million-dollar corruption scandal in the Ministry of Transportation. So this scandal was a purge that occurred, but in the end turned into a retaliation, into persecution against the journalists and the initiators who started the purge. It ended with no serious sanctions against these high-ranking officials who would have been charged for corruption, just like Jiang Zemin did. So on that note, the journalist, as well as the chief police investigator, actually were jailed, ironically, on charges of revealing state secrets and abusing democratic rights. So these two trials are not just stories of irony, right? But they also point to enduring cross-country variations in purge frequency and intensity. So these are the questions that I start with. I attempt to explore why do some regimes purge a lot and purge very violently, whereas some regimes seem to be very reluctant to do so. And the question of how dictators purge and how dictators prevent purges from happening arise from what I say a theory of factional clarity, arise from a crucial dilemma of authoritarian rule. The dilemma that the dictators face, first of all, have to do with the cost of purges. Purges are difficult to launch because it requires a lot of coordination between the dictator himself and the law enforcement power that he has, as well as the media to coordinate all the media, all the publications, all the propaganda about the purges after that. But more importantly, purges are costly in the sense that they can fail. And when they fail, they can create an incentive and a need for retaliation by those who are victims of the purge. And since coup d'etat are one of the most common reasons of a leader, of a dictator losing power, actually, dictators, when they launch a purge, they are afraid of the consequences, of the chances that not only would the purge fail, but those who would be the victims of purge will actually rise up and attempt to coordinate and overthrow the leader himself. And it's not just the enemy, right? Purges can raise suspicions among rivals as well as allies as well. The reason is that there are many political motives for elite purges. Purges can be used to remove those who are corrupt from power, reduce rent-seeking. It can be used to remove elite opposition, these rivals from power. But note that there are purges that everyone in the regime benefits from, those that defeat external threats, those that establish ideological unity among the regime. So these are the kind of purges that maybe will be favored by rivals and allies in the regimes themselves. At the same time, there are purges against the enemies, against rivals or elites, and there are purges that might actually be aimed at dictators' own allies as well. Think about a dictator shrinking the size of a winning coalition, making his allies fewer than in numbers, so that he can divide the same piece, the same cake to fewer people, so that the remaining people have a higher share of goods. These are the purges that even the allies have to be careful of. And so when the dictator tries to attack or tries to purge somebody, not only are the rivals scared and suspicious, but even the allies themselves. So because of this, the dictator has an incentive to do a few things. First, he would like to be able to know if he is strong enough to launch a purge in the first place. Second, he would like to be able to identify who the ally is, who the enemy is, or who the external enemy is in the regime. And third, not only do the dictators need to know, but the allies and other members of the regime should be able to know who the dictator is trying to purge as well. All of this leads to my argument that information about factional membership, who belongs to which team, as well as information about the balance of power, which team is strong, which team is weak in the regime. Ultimately, this kind of information determines the willingness to purge. So what is it about information? Let's think about this. Imagine an elite that the dictator is trying to purge or trying to weaken. Or maybe this is a very strong elite in the regime that the dictator is trying to avoid trying not to antagonize, because this elite has the ability to overthrow the leader, for example. Say, if those around him, those around this difficult elite, some of them belong to his faction, some of them don't belong to his faction. And if these people, the co-faction and the non-faction, mix together, how is it possible for the dictator to identify who he can purge and who he should leave alone? This is a very challenging task, and this makes it very difficult and risky for the dictator to launch a purge. But what if, consider an alternative scenario, what if in the regime there is some sort of cleavage, a cleavage so strong that this elite does not want or cannot recruit people from outside, from the other side of the cleavage into his faction? If that is the case, say if there is a physical border, a mountain, a river, or if it is a social cleavage such as race, ethnicity, that prevents these elites from recruiting from outside, from the other side, then even though membership on this side is very confusing still, the dictator can now know quite clearly that people on this side are very unlikely to be members of this dictator's faction. Now, what if there are not just one cleavage, but a series of cross-cutting cleavage like this? Now, if this is the case, then not only are the membership very clearly identified outside these cleavage, but the cleavage also defined a very, very, very clear borders of the potential membership of this elite faction. So the dictator now knows not only who belongs to which faction, but also how big these elite faction can possibly be. So he can estimate not only membership, but also balance of power as well. And then I argue ultimately that the presence of these cleavages across regimes are what determined information about factional membership and balance of power, and in turn determine the likelihood, the degree of violence of purges, as well as the strategy that the dictators and other allies use to protect their allies. All of these collectively create the image, the variation, the purges outcomes across regimes. Some regimes have a lot of purges. Some regimes have a lot of investigations, but very few actual violent purges, for example. So that is the core of my theory. And for empirical evidence, I bring in my two favorite regimes, Vietnam and China. Vietnam and China are just awesome comparisons, in my opinion, because they do share a lot of similarities in terms of politics, economy, culture, and history. Many of these, including things like the formal institutions, communist formal institutions, the level and form of corruption, the norms of reciprocity have been theorized to play important roles in shaping elite politics, and in particular, political purge. So I do control, by using the Vietnam and China comparison, control for a lot of common explanations for why elites actually kill or attack each other. At the same time, the two countries differ precisely in my variable of interest, that is to say, the cleavages. Those familiar with Chinese politics would know that within the CCP there exist clues and information that have been used very successfully by scholars and politicians alike to guess factional membership and study outcomes related to factionalism. These ties are public, cannot be manipulated. And at least retrospectively, these are the ties of hometown, of education and professional network, 同乡, 同学, and 同志. These together give CCP a very strong, cleavages and make factional memberships very easy to identify. In Vietnam, these ties do have some cultural significance, but they lack the political component to become truly predictive of factional membership. And what makes this even more interesting is that the diversion comes not from an endogenous process like elite politics, but through external historical shocks, actually. The story in brief is that in China, during the revolution, the Kuomintang and the Japanese military threats had the effect of dispersing the CCP into geographically isolated areas. And so these geography, the mountains, the treacherous terrains, and the enemies in between them actually formed the cleavages that allowed these very well-identified factions to emerge. And once the war ended, these faction leaders bring these factions together, and these endured during the peacetime era as well. In contrast, the Vietnamese revolutionary process saw all these elites being concentrated in one area. And so they did not have the room or the comfort to form separate, geographically divided factions. And whenever these emerged, such as during the second Indochina War, right? There are things like the Tet Offensive happened that decimated the southern ranks that kind of emerged from the northern leadership. So whenever there was a chance for a new faction that are separate to emerge, these things happen. Strong, massive defeats happen. And so the Vietnamese entered the modern era with no geographically delineated faction. And using these comparisons, I bring in sort of a qualitative analysis, comparing the histories, and I make three important observations that are consistent with my theories. First of all, Purges campaigns occurred much more frequently in China. When you look at that, during the whole period, during the same amount of time that took the two parties from their, the bands of revolutionary guerrillas to power, many purges occurred. And these are just a limited numbers of campaigns where there are elite members being targeted when there were massive violence occurring. Comparing to China, Vietnam had only perhaps one significant purge where the elites actually targeted, jailed, and removed the other from power, the revisionist anti-party affair in 1967. Not only that, I look at the timing of the purges themselves. The purge campaigns tend to occur in periods where these geographic cleavage became the most dominant, the most salient. If you look at the timeline for China purges, for example, there were a relatively peaceful period after Deng Xiaoping and before Xi Jinping, when the geographical ties that were emerged during the revolutionary eras were sort of being rearranged, and when a new set of ties associated with professional background were being created. During these periods, when ascriptive ties were relatively weak, there were fewer purges. And in Vietnam, the only purges that occurred happened just before the period where the North-South cleavage within the party were the most dominant. Just after this, in 1969 and 1968, the Southern faction would be defeated by the US and the South Vietnamese force, and ascriptive ties would not be relevant anymore. And after this period, we don't see purges happening. Before this period, when North and South cleavages were not strong, we don't see any purges. So that's different in timing. And then in later chapter, I look into some of the most prominent purges in both regimes, and two which include the Cao anti-party affair in China and the revisionist anti-party affair in Vietnam as well. In both purges, there was a very strong evidence of the dictators and the purge initiators actually using these geographic ties to identify who are the likely targets of purge, who they should go after. And it all ended to be the case that after a leader, after a purge, after an elite was purged, the purge initiators, in this case, Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi, would happen to follow the breadcrumbs by going after people who share geographic ties with these purge victims. So when after the purge of Cao, Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi did not just expand the search and find out people who are agreeing with him, who are secretly plotting with Cao to overthrow these leaders. Instead, they went to his workplace in the northeast of China and found people who shared work ties with them including officials who have not shown any sign of involvement in the plot or in the plan that Cao can share. Same thing.
Sweet. Can I ask you to just wrap up here shortly? We want to get Victor and maybe some comments too.
Certainly.
Yeah, thanks.
And I think if you look into the revisionist anti-party affair, it's the same. These people going after Ho Chi Minh's and Phong Nguyen's associates by going after people who share work ties with him, who share professional association with him, and follow the Northerners. They totally ignore the people who even vocally opposed to Le Duan and Le Duc, but otherwise share no geographical ties with him. So those are the piece of historical evidence that I had in terms of why leaders purge. There were a bunch of quantitative evidence regarding this as well, which I'd be happy to share and happy to talk during the Q&A. But generally, that's the preliminary findings I had with regard to why leaders purge and why is it that purges occur so much in China and not so much in Vietnam. Thank you.
Zui and Ed, that was just a fantastic pairing. I mean, this is wonderful research that both of you guys are doing, very deeply motivated by strong theory and with interesting empirical examples of various sorts. Victor, do you want to make a few comments and then maybe we'll open it up to any questions in the Q&A? I still don't see any yet. And then Gold and Ed and Zui can interrogate each other as well.
Yeah, sure. Steph, thanks for inviting me to this panel, which is right up my alley. I mean, in a way, sort of both sets of arguments are very familiar to me. In Ed's case is because I wrote a sort of a game theory paper, which is still work in progress, which making very similar kind of arguments. And I will actually basically, based on the model, also raise a couple of issues that you may want to consider in your qualitative research for both North Korea and also South Korea case studies. In the case of Zui, of course, I advise Zui, so we've been talking about his theory back and forth for quite a number of years. But I will add a couple of observations even in Zui's case. So Ed, I agree with the overall drive of the argument, and this is kind of like our theory paper is the point that we're trying to make, is that even when a potential challenger for the dictator is becoming more threatening by accumulating power, a purge is not necessarily the equilibrium outcome, because if there was an external threat that this person happens to be good at dealing with, then you're not going to get a purge necessarily. A couple of issues that we also worked into our model, which you may want to consider in your cases, is number one, the future expectation about the frequency and the severity of a given threat, right? So let's say China, right? So China is not going away. I mean, China is always going to be a huge issue for North Korea. So in that sense, it doesn't make that much sense to me that Chang Sung-tak, so even Chang, okay, was not able to deliver this deposit from Bank of China or whatever to the Kim family. If he is uniquely have access to the Chinese leadership, you still will need to rely on this person in the future to do something else with respect to China, right? So is it short-sighted, or is it because of some other calculation that the Kim family decided to execute him anyway, right? A related issue is how unique is the skill of the person who's a rising threat to the dictator, right? So if the skills, let's say ties to China is easily replaceable, then yeah, you can go ahead and kill this person or whatever. And it's not a big deal because you can always just find another person just like him to do the same thing. But if this relationship is pretty unique, then that it would be kind of risky to get rid of this person, because what if you will need this person's skills in the future, then you won't be able to find another person to do that job, right? So these are a couple of issues you might want to think about as you think about these cases in your study, which I find fascinating. I think the Korea is definitely understudied in the authoritarian literature. I think both North and South Korea offer a wealth of cases. I also see that you gather some data, so that could be interesting. you and Steph getting together and potentially doing something really cool with the biographical type data that we're doing for China. Okay, very quickly on Zoe. So one thing, I guess, every time I read your work or hear your work, I think of something else. So, maybe I've said this to you already, maybe not, I don't know. So if the argument is about information, right? So the difference between China and Vietnam is sort of one of information. There are clearer cleavages in China than was the case in Vietnam, which I guess that's fine. Except the historical story, I think it's more or less correct. But my question is, in the contemporary period, isn't it better in a sense, and better in the sense that there should be less purges in the Chinese case than in Vietnam, right? So because you can argue that it's better to know who your enemies are than to not know who your enemies are, right? So if you don't have these ascriptive ties, you don't know who your enemies are, maybe there's some randomness to the way in which you purge, and maybe you're purging more than necessary so as to warn your potential enemies not to do anything against you. You can imagine this scenario unfolding, right? So whereas if you knew who your potential challengers are, you don't need to unnecessarily purge the people who are kind of on your side. You can just focus on the one or two factions that are really threatening to you. But that's not what we see, right, in Vietnam. So I wonder whether if there's, on top of this information story, there's also something that not only do these guerrilla bases provide information about the cleavages in the elite, they also lead to real networks which are credible threats against a dictator, right? And this is kind of close to this Levitsky argument about revolutionary history leading to networks. I mean, the one aspect that they kind of did not take into account, this Levitsky way, is that yes, revolution leads to networks, but these networks are divided and can lead to people forming into factions and starting to kill each other and fight each other. So I would urge you to think about these networks as not just information, but like real networks with real power. And that is what the dictator is afraid of. Yeah, so these are my comments. Welcome other people's questions also, obviously.
Yeah, that last comment certainly pertains to the North Korean case as well, where Chiang Kai-shek had accumulated not only this unique capacity with the Chinese, but had his own adherents and networks that lived off returns and rent seeking that he was engaged in. A couple of questions here. Let me start with one on, it's an historical question, but I'm going to generalize it a little bit. One of our attendees says, in the Gaogang case, some of his Northeastern colleagues, the Five Tigers, were purged. However, there were other elites, and a number of names are listed in the Q&A, which you can see, who worked with Gaogang in the Northeast, but were not purged. Why might that be the case? Sweet.
Thanks for the question. And I think honestly, it is a difficult question to actually answer completely, right? It's difficult to know why is an elite not purged, right? Maybe the reason, of course, for when these, zero gaze can be, there can be multiple reasons for this, right? Part of it is that if someone is just totally, maybe is not involved in the purge, or if it is, seen as too strong or too weak or too irrelevant for these purges, I think it is. I wouldn't, dare to provide a definitive answer for that. But on the other hand, I think what is kind of the not purge gaze, I think that are interesting in this Gaogang case are not just these, elites who work with Gaogang, but those who seem to be, or by a lot of evidence, seem to be involved in the purge. That are actually involved in the Gaogang plot, involved in, or at least, those who Gaogang had directly approached and talked to, and who were actually invited to be part of Gaogang's team, but these were not purged. I think Lin Biao is one of the most interesting cases because he was actually, actually talked to, or maybe Peng Dehuai, he's one of the generals who are actually approached by Cao Kang and the team, and were actually invited to, to be part of the team that, kind of overthrew Liu Shaoqi. And why were they not purged? And I think this has to do with, again, I think I stand by, I think the argument is still that when looking for those who are, who are likely associates, they were not, all these rumors or all the evidence about, who's associated with whom, first, were not as important as, the geographic ties. And second, I think these ties also indicate factional affiliation, in the sense that if Cao Kang fell, who would the next ones be? Who would be not protected in the regime? And I think those who work, especially those who were under Cao Kang in the northeastern area, and not, I'm not talking about his superiors or something else, are seen as likely victims, are as easy targets, because now that their leaders are gone, these are going to be, by the idea of factional clarity, by the idea of these cleavages, they are going to be without a protector, without elite protector, and so these became easy targets. In contrast, people like Peng Dehuai, for example, they belong to different group of cleavage, different side of cleavage, and so the removal of Cao Kang does not necessarily mean a weakening of the protection for Peng Dehuai, for example. And these are the reasons why I think people like these are not purged. So maybe these are not the direct answers to these questions, but that's what,
No,
what
it's good. And do you want to respond to Victor? And then if you have any comments, and then I want to come back to one,
Yes.
at least one last question.
Sure. I think there's no doubt that the cleavages do not just provide information, right? But since the cleavages limited people to recruiting members from within a specific, subset of the population, it actually creates a sense of community, a sense of belonging. It allowed people to form not just information, but trust as well. So I think these are real, and these are, the networks are actually powerful, not as just, number, the name, but actually as association, as loyalty, like Victor suggested. I think the argument about information is more like that, not just information about who belongs to whom, but who can be loyal to whom. And the sharpness of the cleavages actually had both, had both uses, right? On one hand, it actually alert the dictators to which side people are on. And the other side, the other use is that it allowed these elites who do not belong to the leaders to actually advertise the strength of their faction as well. I do have these people on my side, and they are fervently loyal to me. So, and these are actually what, what can be useful as well to not just the dictators, but also to the elites as well. And I think in the China case, right, but it is only useful when you actually do have a strong faction, right? If you have a clear cleavage, but if you're in a weak faction, then you're in a bad spot. And I think that is the case that is going on right now in contemporary China, where, a lot of leaders actually have very strong factional network, but, the factions are either small or they are not as strong as Xi Jinping's faction. And these, network of loyalty actually serve as, kind of a problem for them, because they cannot pretend that they are stronger than they are.
Right. Good. And do you want to respond to Victor? And then I'd like to ask one last question if we could.
Sure. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much, Victor. Yeah, really helpful points for me to think about. Obviously, I'd want to think about them in more detail, but I think my immediate reaction is I think the sort of key point that probably gets at both questions, because as you said, they're very related, is it's about timing, I think. So I like the phrase I wrote down, China's not going away. And so Zhang might be, let's just to use the case I spoke about. So Zhang's crucial to managing the relationship with China. And even in 2013, even if Kim, let's say he has greater financial autonomy, greater autonomy in any other sense as well from China. But as you say, China is still going to be the hegemon in Asia. So surely if Jiang was valuable in 2011, then surely he's still valuable in 2013. And I think it's more that I think because Kim is trading off those alternative kinds of threats, whether it's the coup threat or the outsider threat. And so at that moment in time in 2013, he judges that now is the right time to start demoting and then execute Jiang later in the year. And in the meantime, whether himself through the visits that he started to do to China in later years, or through other officials, that he can essentially replace that skill or attribute within his ruling coalition, so that if there becomes a time when, say, pressure from China becomes more prescient, or he has a greater need to please Xi Jinping, then by that point in time, that skill or attribute within the North Korean ruling coalition will have been replaced. But yeah, that's just off the top of my head. I need to think about your questions in greater detail, but yeah, thank you.
Well, this was a terrific discussion. I'm going to just pose one last question. We only have a couple of minutes, but it's an idea that came to me. I'm wondering if there's an optimal rank at which to purge. And by that, I mean that there may be a deterrent effect, which is very significant if you can purge at a high level. Because being able to purge someone like Jang Sung-tak reveals a tremendous amount about Kim Jong-un's capacity to control the security apparatus, which actually has to carry this out. And it was interesting to me that despite the fact that there were certainly, Jang Sung-tak had a significant network, the number of people who were killed along with him, I think, was relatively small, right?
Yeah, just on the latter point very briefly, I've heard very different accounts of this. So without naming specific sources, there are certain North Korean defectors in Seoul who are pushing a narrative that there were huge numbers of people who were purged next year. But I haven't had been able to verify that from other sources. So just on that specific point, I'm not particularly confident. I think I'm skirting around your question rather than answering it properly, Steph, but I wonder if it comes back to, I think there's a sort of, it's a Machiavellian point that's made, I think, by Friedrich and Brzezinski as well, which when you purge someone quite senior, the dictator doesn't need to worry so much about retaliation, not necessarily because of the display of force that they've exhibited, but because they're opening up new resources, new opportunities for other people within the ruling coalition. But then I think that I'm very undecided on this point, but because I think the counter argument to that is that any kind of purge, and probably especially a purge at like a high rank, demonstrates a dictator's weak commitments to power sharing. And so if you're coming after this elite now, how do I know it's not going to be me in the future?
Right, but it's also demonstrating capability is my point. So
yeah.
If you're capable of purging at a certain level, you're demonstrating that you're capable of purging at that level. I mean, it sounds circular, but I think you get my.
Yeah, not to, obviously I didn't present it today, but I've got some other work on effects of purges that I'm hoping to get out soon. And I show that whilst purges essentially lead to more attempted coups, i.e. so they do generate some kind of instability, but they also make coups less likely to be successful. And I think that does come to your point of, I mean, it's similar to the Erica de Bruin's findings on counterbalancing.
Right. Oh, extremely interesting. Victor, we're right at 5, but do you have any last words? If not, we'll conclude and just offer our thanks to Zui and Ed.
Yeah, no, I think Zoe should also think about your last comment, which is, if there's a payoff in purging someone for its own sake, to demonstrate your power, again, why don't you see more of that in Vietnam? I agree with you, Steph, that it is a very credible sign of power when you can just get rid of someone very senior level, whether this person is historically close to you or not close to you. That's almost irrelevant. The fact that you can do it, there's a cost to it. Obviously, you're not sharing power and all that kind of stuff. That's true, but also there's a benefit, which is that you incredibly demonstrate, show force.
Right.
So why not in Vietnam then?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I guess what
We-
Zoe's saying is that you
Yeah.
don't have that capacity to do it. So then you're basically
Right,
saying that
right.
inherently the dictator's power is weaker on average in Vietnam than in China, kind of, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think Steph's comments are spot on, right? You demonstrate your capacity to purge a senior ally by purging the senior ally, right? But if you don't have that capacity,
You
is
can't do
there
it.
any way you can demonstrate something that you don't have? And I think that is something to be the case in Vietnam and not so much in China. That certainly, but when we bring in the argument about capacity, there's a lot of things to discuss about as well. So I think it's a rather complicated thing.
Well, we clearly haven't even scratched the surface of this, but that was terrific. And Ed, thanks particularly for you for coming in from Hong Kong. Victor and Zui, it's always a pleasure to see your great work. Thanks, everyone. Remember, next week, we're on at noon on Monday with Melissa Hannum talking about issues of using satellite imagery for the purpose of open source intelligence. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye all.